Picture this moment. You wake to the soft glow of morning light filtering through your window. The world's still quiet, your mind clear. Then, almost instinctively, your hand reaches for that small device beside your bed. But within seconds, you're pulled into a torrent of breaking news, urgent headlines, and the collective anxiety of millions. Wars rage in distant lands, economies crumble, politicians deceive, and disasters unfold across your screen. Your heart rate quickens, your breathing becomes shallow, the peaceful morning dissolves into a cascade of worry, anger, and helplessness. This is the modern condition awakening not to the natural world, but to the manufactured chaos of infinite information. But what if there existed a way to engage with this digital realm without losing yourself to its emotional storms? What if ancient wisdom, forged in the crucible of Roman adversity over 2,000 years ago, could serve as your compass through the turbulent waters of online discourse? The Stoics Marcus Aurelius, who ruled an empire while plague ravaged his lands. Seneca, who navigated the treacherous politics of Nero's court. Epictetus, who found freedom despite being born into slavery. These philosophers understood something profound about the human condition that remains eternally relevant. They discovered that our suffering comes not from external events themselves, but from our judgments about those events. When Marcus Aurelius opened his eyes each morning as Emperor of Rome, he faced reports of barbarian invasions, political conspiracies, natural disasters that threatened the very foundations of civilization. Yet in his private journal, later published as Meditations, he wrote not of despair, but of acceptance and inner strength. He understood that while he could not control the Germanic tribes pressing against Rome's borders, he could control his response to that threat. This same principle applies with startling clarity to our modern digital dilemma. You cannot control what appears in your news feed, but you can absolutely control how you interpret and respond to that information. The first lesson, a Stoic. It learns about confronting bad news, whether delivered by a messenger on horseback or through fiber optic cables, is the fundamental distinction between what is within our control and what lies beyond it. Epictetus, despite his physical chains, declared himself the freest man in Rome because he recognized this simple truth. The headline that proclaims economic collapse, the video that shows violence in distant cities, the social media post that spreads misinformation, these exist independently of your emotional state. They are facts in the external world, no different from a storm cloud gathering on the horizon. You did not create them. You cannot undo them. Your worry about them changes nothing, except your own inner peace. Consider the metaphor at Epictetus, used of the actor in a play. The playwright assigns you a role, perhaps that of a king, perhaps that of a beggar, but your job is not to rewrite the script. Your job is to play your assigned part with excellence and virtue. In the context of internet consumption, you have been assigned the role of a conscious observer in an age of information abundance. You did not choose to live in an era where every tragedy, every injustice, every moment of human suffering can be instantly transmitted to your awareness. But this is the role you must play. The question becomes not whether you can escape this reality, but how you can engage with it while maintaining your dignity, your peace, and your capacity for rational action. The Stoic approach to bad news begins with a practice that feels almost heretical in our hyper-connected age: the deliberate pause. Before you react to that inflammatory headline, before you share that outrageous story, before you allow your emotions to spiral into anxiety or rage, you create space. Seneca wrote that we suffer more in imagination than in reality, and nowhere. Is this more evident than in our relationship with digital media? The moment you read about a distant crisis, your mind begins to construct elaborate scenarios about how this might affect you, your family, your future. You imagine economic collapse, social upheaval, personal danger, most of which exists only in the realm of possibility, not probability, and certainly not in the present moment where your actual life unfolds. This pause is not indifference. It is discrimination. It is the difference between being a leaf blown about by every gust of digital wind and being a sturdy tree with deep roots and wisdom. During this pause, you ask yourself the essential Stoic questions. Is this information actionable? For me? Does my emotional reactions serve any constructive purpose? What would I do differently in my actual life based on this knowledge? If the answer is nothing, if this bad news neither requires nor enables any meaningful action on your part, then you have identified it for what it truly is. Entertainment disguised as importance, mental junk food that satisfies no real need while depleting your emotional resources. The ancient Stoics lived in a world where bad news traveled slowly, arriving perhaps days or weeks after events occurred. This natural delay provided built-in wisdom by the time you heard about a distant calamity. Either it had resolved itself, or your initial emotional response had been tempered by time and reflection. Today, we receive information faster than evolution prepared our nervous systems to handle. We experience the stress of global awareness without the corresponding power to influence global events. This mismatch creates what we might call omniscience anxiety, the burden of knowing about problems we cannot solve, suffering we cannot alleviate, in dangers we cannot escape. Marcus Aurelius offers us a profound reframe for this modern predicament. In his meditations, he regularly practiced viewing events from the perspective of cosmic time. A scandal that dominates today's headlines will be forgotten within months. A political crisis that seems to threaten the very fabric of society will resolve itself one way or another. As similar crises have been resolving themselves throughout human history, this is not cynical dismissal. It is the cultivation of appropriate perspective. When you zoom out far enough, you begin to see that most of what passes for urgent news is simply the normal turbulence of human existence. It's amplified and accelerated by technology. But perspective alone is not enough. The Stoic also cultivates what Epictetus called the discipline of desire, the practice of wanting what happens, rather than demanding that what happens conform to our preferences. This might sound like passive resignation, but it is actually the foundation of effective action. When you spend your energy fighting against reality, becoming angry about election results, despairing over distant tragedies, raging against the general unfairness of existence, you exhaust yourself battling windmills. When you accept reality as your starting point rather than your enemy, you conserve that energy for the areas where you can actually make a difference. This acceptance transforms how you consume information online. Instead of approaching news with the implicit expectation that the world should be peaceful, fair, and comprehensible, you approach it with the mature understanding that the world contains suffering, injustice, and chaos, and that this has always been true. The ancient Romans dealt with plagues, invasions, and political corruption. Medieval Europeans faced famines, wars, and religious persecution. Every generation has confronted existential threats and moral crises. What makes our era unique is not the presence of problems, but the speed and volume with which we learn about problems occurring everywhere simultaneously. Seneca, who managed vast wealth and political influence while maintaining his philosophical practice, understood the particular challenge of staying centered while engaging with worldly affairs. He developed what we might call the practice of provisional engagement. Participating fully in public life while holding lightly to outcomes applied to internet consumption. This means staying informed about issues that matter to you while refusing to derive your sense of identity or security from how those issues unfold. You can care about climate change without being crushed by every report of environmental destruction. You can support social justice without being paralyzed by every instance of injustice. You can stay politically aware without treating every election as an apocalyptic battle for the soul of humanity. The key lies in what the Stoics called preferred indifference, things that are naturally preferable but not essential to your well-being or virtue. Peace is preferable to war, but your character does not depend on whether there is peace in the world. Justice is preferable to corruption, but your integrity remains intact regardless of whether justice prevails in every courtroom. Prosperity is preferable to poverty, but your dignity is not determined by economic conditions.
When you anchor
your sense of self to virtue rather than to external outcomes, you become antifragile in the face of bad news. Instead of being damaged by negative information, you can use it as an opportunity to practice courage, wisdom, justice, and self-discipline. This internal anchoring allows you to develop what might be called compassionate detachment. You feel genuine concern for human suffering without drowning in overwhelm. You stay engaged with important issues without losing yourself to rage or despair. You maintain hope without depending on specific outcomes to validate that hope. This is perhaps the most sophisticated psychological skill a person can develop. In the digital age, the ability to care deeply while holding lightly, to act decisively while accepting uncertainty. Marcus Aurelius regularly reminded himself that external events are neutral until we assign meaning to them through our judgments. A stock market crash is simply numbers changing on screens until we decide it means economic doom. A political scandal is simply information about human behavior until we decide it represents the collapse of moral order. A natural disaster is simply the movement of physical forces until we decide it signifies divine punishment or human helplessness. The Stoic practices separating the raw facts from the interpretive narrative, recognizing that while we cannot control the facts, we have complete sovereignty over the narrative. This separation becomes practical when applied to social media algorithms, which are specifically designed to trigger strong emotional responses. The platform wants you to feel outraged, afraid, or urgently compelled to share content because strong emotions drive engagement, and engagement drives advertising revenue. Your emotional reactivity is quite literally the product being sold. Understanding this dynamic allows you to engage with social media as a Stoic would engage with any other potentially manipulative force with awareness, boundaries, and strategic purpose. The Stoic does not avoid bad news out of cowardice or denial. Instead, they approach it with what Seneca called rational preparation, the practice of mentally rehearsing potential challenges so that you can respond to them with wisdom rather than panic. When you regularly contemplate the impermanence of all external conditions, bad news loses its power to destabilize you. You have already accepted intellectually and emotionally that loss, change, and suffering are woven into the fabric of existence. This acceptance does not make you callous, it makes you resilient. Epictetus taught his students to imagine themselves as archers. You can control your stance, your aim, and your release, but once the arrow leaves your bow, external factors win. Distance, the movement of the target determine where it lands. Your responsibility ends with the quality of your shot. Similarly, you can control the quality of your attention, the depth of your thinking, and the integrity of your actions. But you cannot control whether your efforts result in the outcomes you prefer. This understanding liberates you from the exhausting burden of trying to manage reality through worry, anger, or compulsive information consumption. The practice of morning reflection, which Marcus Aurelius maintained throughout his reign, becomes especially valuable in our era of constant connectivity. Before engaging with the digital world, you establish your philosophical foundation. You remind yourself of what truly matters: your character, your relationships, your capacity for growth and service. You acknowledge that you will likely encounter information today that could disturb your peace if you allow it to. You commit to responding from wisdom rather than impulse, to maintaining perspective rather than being swept away by the intensity of the moment. This morning practice creates what the Stoics called the inner citadel, a place of refuge within yourself that remains untouchable, regardless of external circumstances. Politicians may lie, economies may fluctuate, natural disasters may strike, but your inner citadel remains secure. It is built not from stone or steel, but from the practice of virtue, the cultivation of wisdom, the daily choice to focus your energy on what you can control rather than what you cannot. Throughout the day, as you encounter various forms of bad news, you return to this inner citadel. You ask yourself, how can I use this information to become a better person? What virtues does this situation call forth from me? How can I respond in a way that I will be proud of when I reflect on this moment in the future? These questions transform passive consumption into active practice. Instead of being diminished by bad news, you use it as raw material for character development. The Stoic also understands the importance of curating their information diet with the same care they would curate their physical diet. You would not consume poison simply because it was freely available. Similarly, you need not consume every piece of toxic information simply because it appears on your screen. This does not mean avoiding difficult truths or surrounding yourself with pleasant fiction. It means being intentional about the sources you trust, the frequency with which you check for updates, and the purposes for which you consume news. Seneca advised, spending time each day in reflection and study, activities that nourish the soul rather than merely stimulating it. In our context, this might mean balancing news consumption with reading philosophy, literature, or other forms of wisdom tradition. It might mean following your daily news update with a walk in nature, a conversation with a friend, or engagement in meaningful work. The goal is to maintain an intellectual diet that strengthens your character rather than weakening it. The Stoic approach to bad news ultimately rests on a paradox. By caring less about controlling external outcomes, you become more effective at influencing them. By reducing your emotional reactivity to negative information, you increase your capacity for wise action. By accepting the world as it is, rather than demanding it conform to your preferences, you find the leverage points where your efforts can actually make a difference. This is not the path of the optimist who believes everything will work out fine, nor the path of the pessimist who expects everything to go wrong. This is the path of the realist, who understands that life contains both joy and suffering, both progress and setbacks, both triumph and tragedy, and that wisdom lies not in avoiding these realities, but in engaging with them skillfully. When you master the art of receiving bad news without losing your center, you discover something remarkable. You become a source of stability in an unstable world. Others begin to turn to you, not for false reassurance, but for genuine perspective. You become someone who can discuss difficult topics without becoming overwrought, who can face uncertainty without panic, who can acknowledge problems without despair. In a culture addicted to emotional extremes, this balance becomes a rare and valuable gift. The journey of the modern Stoic is not about achieving perfect equanimity in the face of all information. Such perfection belongs to philosophical ideals rather than human reality. The journey is about gradual improvement, about responding to today's bad news with slightly more wisdom than you brought to yesterday's challenges. Each time you pause before reacting, each time you choose perspective over panic, each time you focus on your response rather than demanding different circumstances, you strengthen the muscles of wisdom. Marcus Aurelius reminds us that we are not here to merely endure existence, but to flourish within it, to extract meaning and growth from whatever circumstances we encounter. The constant stream of bad news on the internet, rather than being an obstacle to flourishing, can become an opportunity to practice the highest human capacities: rational thinking, emotional regulation, moral courage, and compassionate action. In the end, the measure of a life well lived is not whether you successfully avoided all exposure to negative information, but whether you transformed that exposure into wisdom. The ancient Stoics faced their own versions of bad news reports, of military defeats, notifications of natural disasters, updates about political corruption, and used these challenges to forge characters of remarkable strength and serenity. You have the same opportunity, equipped with the same tools, facing the same fundamental choice that has confronted every human. Being throughout history, will you be defeated by circumstances beyond your control, or will you use those circumstances to discover the power that lies within your control? The answer, as always, rests entirely with you. And that, perhaps more than any external news could ever be, is the most empowering truth of all.